In my previous video, I had speculated that the giant monk, which I've tentatively named Sougen, not only would serve as the first boss in the PlayStation 1 prototype of Onimusha, but that Sougen himself was armed with the Oni Gauntlet, and that this boss fight would be how Samanosuke would gain the power of the Oni. After recently discovering some more articles covering the game's early production, it appears that all, or most, of my speculations were correct. Judging by screenshots covering the boss fight in the September 17, 1999 issue of Famitsu magazine, it does appear that this giant monk is wearing an Oni Gauntlet. If we take this lightning strike into account as well, it seems safe to conclude that the monk is using the Shiden Orb, making this boss fight the likely event where Samanosuke obtains both the Oni Gauntlet and his first elemental weapon. Originally, I had guessed that the weapon Sougen was using could have been a hanabo, a type of club. With these new images, now it seems to be a type of sword. While both the hanabo and Japanese longswords were usually meant to be wielded with two hands, in these screenshots, there's a line of blood running across the length of the weapon. This looks to me like the weapon has a cutting edge, thus tipping the balance in favor of a sword-like weapon. One point of confusion, however, is the thing covering the point of the weapon. If it is a sword that Sougen is wielding, that covering would make it kind of difficult to use the sword for anything other than slashing or smashing. Maybe this thing is a cap of some sort. Perhaps Sougen, being a monk, still adopts a semi-pacifistic approach to fighting, with the cap at the end of the weapon serving as a kind of limiter for his skills. Though Sougen has clearly killed before, and probably had training in killing techniques before the events of Onimusha, being a Sohei after all, perhaps this cap is there to remind Sougen to keep his bloodshed to a minimum, to contain the bloodshed, or possibly to focus it only on situations that serve the greater good, such as killing Genma. That said, considering that he is an antagonist for Samanosuke, he could be assisting the Genma. I did propose in the previous video that Sougen might have been captured and experimented on by Guildenstern. Even if it is true that Sougen is in league with the Genma, he could just be using the same kind of weapon that he would have used originally, assuming he was always gigantic. There are also the electrical properties of Sougen's attacks to consider. Other than his bum rush, the only attack of Sougen's that has been shown publicly or leaked is the one where Sougen raises his weapon into the air and slams it to the ground, creating an electric shockwave. Presumably, this is Sougen using the Shiden Orb that he has equipped to perform a magic attack. About the only other guess that I would have is maybe the cap at the end of Sougen's weapon assists the properties of the Shiden Orb, helping to conduct or spread electricity within a wider area. Here we have our first semi-legible screenshots of Kaede's PS1 model. I had suspected that Kaede was in some of the footage that was shown at the 1999 Tokyo Game Show, but because that footage was captured through a camera pointing at the screen, rather than a direct capture of the footage, The image quality wasn't all that good, and I couldn't be sure whether Kaede was blending into the brightly lit background or whether I was just seeing things. But it appears these screenshots are from the same scene, and that Kaede, though hard to see, was thus briefly glimpsed in the Tokyo Game Show footage. The dialogue that is spoken within the screenshots also seems to correspond to the first in-game cutscene, where Samanosuke and Kaede meet with a guard who directs them on how they can reach the castle. Though the guard consists of 2 people here, and only 1 person in the final PS2 version of the scene, there are 2 pieces of dialogue here that make me think this scene in the PS1 version and the opening in-game cinematic from the PS2 version depict the same events. This first sentence here, something along the lines of, "Understood, we'll take it from here," starts with the word "wakatta," which is an informal way of saying "understood." In the PS2 version of the scene, when Samanosuke and Kaede are presented with 2 paths to the castle, Samanosuke directs Kaede to go down the left-hand path, with Kaede responding with "wakatta wa," which is another informal way of saying "understood." While "wakatta" seems to be directed at the foot soldiers in the PS1 scene, rather than at Samanosuke, this second piece of dialogue in the PS1 scene, something like "circle around the back," seems to confirm that Samanosuke is directing Kaede to split up, like they do in the PS2 version of the scene, and the use of "wakatta wa" may be a carryover and adjustment of dialogue from the PS1 version of the scene. If we can confidently conclude that this is the beginning of the game, then we should also take note of a key detail here. The first in-game scene takes place at night. Since the events of the final released game take place over the course of a few hours, it looks like the events of Onimusha Demon Warrior were meant to be spread out over the course of the night, rather than beginning in the evening. I think this beginning-to-end nighttime setting would more closely fit the survival horror trappings that the first Onimusha, and subsequent Onimusha games to lesser degrees, inherited from the Resident Evil series. The harsh lighting of the scene is emphasized, and the overall mood for this beginning feels more dark and disquieting. In the Famitsu article, there is speculation that one of the screenshots indicates item boxes will be used in Onimusha. Considering how the image is framed, the box certainly looks important. The eye is naturally drawn to it. However, it also looks pre-rendered. In the original Resident Evil games, while the environments were mostly pre-rendered, the item boxes used 3D models, which would presumably have made them easier from a game design standpoint to open and close, as it would be easier for the player to identify the boxes as an interactive object, and it would be less work for the artists in charge of the pre-rendered backgrounds. Considering how late into the PlayStation 1's life cycle that Onimusha was being produced, perhaps Capcom would have been willing to experiment, giving their background artists the task of preparing a GIF image animation for a pre-rendered item box when the player interacts with it. Games that had pre-rendered backgrounds at this time were more willing to go the extra mile by implementing animations in the backgrounds. Squaresoft in particular loved to hybridize their pre-rendered backgrounds between normal pictures and full-on FMVs. That said, this pre-rendered item box could also have just been a placeholder. If it is true that there were item boxes in Onimusha Demon Warrior, I think it's safe to say that this prototype would have also had a limited inventory system. Our already armored warrior may have had to subsist on the few items that he can carry on his person, forced to rely on careful planning and strategy to determine what resources he needs for the journey ahead, thus making downtime in the save room to reorganize their inventory a necessity. In the finished game, though there are no item boxes, most rooms where you can save do have a magic pool where you can recharge your magic meter. One proposal I could make is that, in the prototype, fighting with monsters and obtaining certain items might have been the only way to replenish magic energy, with all the places that would contain a magic pool in the released version originally containing an item box. With all this in mind, if Onimusha was originally meant to take place entirely at night, and if it was meant to have things like item boxes and limited inventory space, I do have to wonder, was Onimusha meant to have more survival horror? For a long time, there has been a part of me that has fantasized about Onimusha's PlayStation 1 prototype having a similar look, feel, and horror to Kuon, a survival horror title that takes place in Japan's Heian period. In this game, the manor you explore is filled with dark hallways and courtyards, dimly lit by lanterns and torches, while melee combat is a valid tactic, with characters ranging from a weak shrine maiden armed with a dagger, an apprentice onmyoji trained to use a bladed fan, and an onmyoji master skilled with a naginata. The economy of motion for Kuon's melee combat system is limited, and a character can be easily overwhelmed by enemies, no matter how skilled they may be in melee combat, thus requiring the characters to make use of magic talismans. In the Dengeki article from June 1999, Keiji Inafune insists that, rather than going for scares, he wanted to focus on coolness when developing Onimusha, distinguishing Samanosuke's strong, determined, forward-marching swordsman from Resident Evil's unprepared, defensive protagonists of varying fighting ability. It does seem to me that, even if Flagship, the team behind Onimusha, originally meant only to adopt the Resident Evil gameplay and aesthetic as the base structure for the game, it might have been too much to resist having the Resident Evil DNA infect the game's overall mood and focus. I don't think it's an accident that advertisements for the first game during its initial production seem to emphasize Onimusha's horror elements. The various pieces of preview footage that have been shown for Onimusha Demon Warrior detail imagery and scenes that seem intentionally creepy and unsettling. This creepy imagery is also shown in various magazine articles. I can easily imagine this gnarly screenshot of a zombie Genma being taken from our first in-game look at the Genma, the Onimusha turn-around zombie, so to speak. If the Onimusha team truly intended to create more of an action-adventure experience rather than outright survival horror, maybe moving the production over to the PlayStation 2 is what the team needed to refocus their efforts. Gone are some of the more intimidating details of the environment, and though the atmosphere is still dark, the various areas of the game are better illuminated and encourage more of a sense of mystery and awe. Even so, the team behind the first Onimusha seemed to continue having conflicting ideas over the game's identity. In 2002, Genma Onimusha was released, which introduced new features seemingly designed to ratchet up fear and tension. First, we have the green soul mechanic. Green souls occasionally leave enemies when they are damaged. The player can enter into a tug-of-war with the Genma they are fighting to acquire these green souls, which, when enough are acquired by the player, grant them temporary invincibility. This is seemingly a prototype of the Oni transformation mechanic introduced in Onimusha 2. Unfortunately, if the Genma manages to absorb the green souls, they will enter into a frenzied state, attacking more aggressively. Second is the introduction of a new boss character, Ayame, a killer doll stalking Samanosuke in the tradition of the Nemesis from Resident Evil 3. Ayame is extremely difficult to kill, only vulnerable to magic attacks, and the newly introduced charge attack. Not only is attempting to kill her a stressful experience, but there is more than one Ayame doll that will patrol certain areas. Our third feature, the Oni Tower, is an additional, more elaborate dark realm, at least in its function. After obtaining the secret key, Samanosuke can gain access to a gate in the west area of Inabayama Castle that is inaccessible in the PlayStation 2 version. This gate opens up a path to the Oni Tower, a 30-floor building where Samanosuke, by defeating increasingly difficult enemies, can gain items and use the red souls he gains in combat to open up higher floors. Not only must Samanosuke face another new boss, a living suit of Oni armor, in order to get the best armor in the game, Samanosuke must face Ayame again in a fight that cannot be avoided. I had already suspected that the Oni Tower, or at least some of its assets, were initially intended for the PS2 version of Onimusha, but were left unfinished until the Genma Onimusha release. It could be that the tower was even a holdover from the PS1 prototype, if the up-resed versions of some of Demon Warrior's environments, found on the PS2, PC, and HD versions of Onimusha Warlords, are any indication. While I'm not sure how much of the material introduced in Genma Onimusha was a holdover from Warlords or any of its prototypes, just the idea that unused material might have been repurposed or new material created for the express purpose of increasing the fear and tension experienced by anyone playing Genma Onimusha makes me question the developer's intent. Maybe Flagship was just too tempted by the Resident Evil ingredients they were using. It's like they couldn't avoid making Onimusha more of a survival horror game when they brought it to the Xbox. Or more like its prototypes. I think that's about it for this video. Right now, I am in my dorm room, waiting out a snowstorm, and I have no closet to record in. So I'm hunkered down under my desk. To say this video was a long time coming would be an understatement. Work officially started somewhere between a year and a year and a half ago. Unfortunately, sometime in November, the external hard drive where most of my work was stored gave up on me, and I pretty much had to start over. I was hoping to get it done and posted by Christmas. then by my birthday, then New Year's, none of which panned out. Finally, it's being released about 2 months after I restarted. Special thanks to Snowy Aria and her Discord group for their continuing help with translations. I'm currently taking my second Japanese course, but we're still at the elementary level. I still have a long ways to go, but hopefully by the time I graduate, I'll have some good foundations that I can work with. Also, special thanks to you all. Towards the end of last year, I got 10,000 views. I'm hoping this year to post more than the 3 or so videos a year I've been doing lately. I at least want to try and double the output. And who knows, maybe I can get up to 20,000 views by the end of the year, if the algorithm is willing. Either way, I'll do my best. Thank you.